Good day. Today, my video might be somewhat shorter than usual, something which I suspect many people will be relieved about. The reason, very simply, is that one of my children has a minor ailment, and this being the weekend, my wife and I are having to devote most of our time to childcare. But to the extent that I can, on what is turning out to be a most eventful day, I will do a program and I will take it as long as it is possible to do. Firstly and briefly, the news this morning is dominated by dramatic events in the Middle East. Firstly, there's been a major bomb attack, undoubtedly a jihadi bomb attack, in the city of Homs in Syria. Allegedly 80 people were killed over the course of that attack. There are reports today that the Syrian and Russian air forces are carrying out heavy bomb strikes against jihadi positions in Idlib. Again, this is a complex, important story. We see that President Assad has recently been in China. We have discussed this on the Duran. We've done a dedicated program to that visit. On the point of that visit, Alex Christoforou and I. This is clearly an attempt to try to disrupt the events of stabilization in Syria, which that visit by President Assad to China signals, and perhaps to slow the process of Syrian-Turkish rapprochement, which has been taking place with stops and starts ever since the middle of last year. But anyway, that is big news, but I'm not going to discuss it at length in this program. It would require a lot more time, and that, of course, as I've said, is something this morning that I am short of. But the events in Syria are grave and significant. They have been overshadowed by the much more intense, much larger scale events in Israel and in the Palestinian territories. Now, this morning, there are lots of reports all over the Western media about a major missile attacks and incursions by fighters, Hamas fighters, into Israel. There are lots of reports that claim that Israeli civilians have been killed, that Israeli checkpoints have been captured, that Israeli soldiers have been captured, and indeed there is some evidence, there is in fact conclusive evidence of the latter. There's also reports of many Israeli civilians having been taken to hospital. The way that this has been reported in the West might lead one to think that this incident has come out of the clear blue sky, that this is an attack that has been launched without any previous warning. On the moon of Alabama, however, there are reports completely unreported in the Western media, but I've no reason to doubt that they are true. But anyway, it's something I have only read in the moon of Alabama, that there was apparently an incursion by Israeli settlers into the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. This is one of the most important religious centers in Islam. And it, from the language I understand that's coming from Hamas and from other Palestinian officials and spokesmen, this incursion is, in some respects or in some way, a retaliation for that event. I want to make it very clear that I am not fully informed about these events. Focus on Ukraine, perhaps over-focus on Ukraine, a fault which I share with many others in the West. It's been complained about often by many people across the global South. Perhaps means that little reported or unreported by the Western media events in the Middle East, like this incursion into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, have apparently happened, and to say honestly, I've not been aware of them. Suffice to say that an event like that would certainly have provoked a very strong reaction from the Palestinian population and from the Muslim community across the world. And it might, to some extent, explain what has happened. But it is also clear to me that an event of the scale that we are seeing, an attack of the scale that we're seeing, of the kind that Hamas is currently launching against Israel, would have required a great deal of planning and a great deal of preparation, logistical preparation over many months, perhaps even years. And if the very sketchy and ambiguous reports of what is taking place are even remotely true, one would be justified in talking about an actual offensive, a kind of offensive being launched against Israel by what up to this point has been an irregular militia. And of course, it is receiving verbal backing from Hezbollah, the powerful militia, actually more like an army, that is based in Lebanon. And of course, Hezbollah is a Shia force, Hamas is Muslim, is Sunni rather. Despite that fact, these two militias, Hamas and Hezbollah, have worked closely with each other and have close contacts with each other. And I understand that the president of the Palestinian territories, or at least of those parts of the Palestinian territories controlled by the Palestinian government, President Abbas, has in effect given his support to this operation by Hamas. So, a well-prepared, carefully prepared operation. Israel is already taking strong counter steps. It's launched bombing attacks on Gaza. The Israeli Air Force is active. Prime Minister Netanyahu says that Israel is in a state of war and is being attacked, and he says that Israel's retaliation will be on a scale that we have not seen. Well, that is the kind of understandable rhetoric one should expect in these kind of situations. Now, I'm going to make a number of observations. Firstly, large scale and intense as this attack by Hamas undoubtedly is, it cannot place the existence of Israel in any kind of jeopardy, and though it can cause significant damage and destruction and loss of life, ultimately the power of the Israeli armed forces is such that in some way and in some form and at some point in time they will presumably be able to contain this, unless there is a larger war involving firstly Hezbollah and ultimately the Arab states. And I have to say that I personally think all that is unlikely. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that there has been clearly a major collapse in Israel's intelligence operation. And I find this remarkable. Mossad, which I understand is Israel's main intelligence agency, has a worldwide reputation for tremendous ability. It's a pretty ruthless organization as well. But it's clear to me that the Israeli leaders were caught completely by surprise by these events, that they didn't expect them, and that this has come upon them like a bolt out of a clear blue sky. So clearly something there has gone seriously wrong. The third is that we don't know how long this operation will continue, how long the fighting will continue, but it does have the potential to draw attention away from events in Ukraine. And of course, it could also trigger further moves in the Middle East of a geopolitical nature. Saudi Arabia, for example, is already saying that it is not prepared to establish diplomatic relations with Israel until there is a general settlement of the Palestinian issue, disappointing the United States. And it looks as if it could be, or so it seems to me, it looks likely that there will be a further trend in the Middle East away from the United States, and the United States' position as a mediator looks even shakier than usual. I suspect, in fact, I would not be at all surprised, in fact, if we're going to hear criticism over the next days and weeks that the United States has neglected its responsibilities towards Israel because of its undue focus on events in Ukraine. And also, I would not be surprised to see if there is criticism of the president himself, of President Biden, who also has and is known to have a difficult and complicated and fraught relationship with Israel's leader, Prime Minister Netanyahu. Lastly, there is, of course, the general effect of these events on the vexed question of an eventual settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and of the Israeli-Arab conflict, the greater Israeli-Arab conflict. This has gone unresolved throughout my lifetime and beyond. I'm not sure what effect this event will have on that. That remains to be seen. And of course, it also will matter both what the scale of this event actually is and what the scale of the Israeli reaction is and what the actions of the Western powers will be. Now, as to that, I am not going to get into the weeds. I'm not going to try and say exactly what is happening at the moment, which checkpoints have been captured, how many Israeli soldiers have been killed or captured, whether it is true, as I'm also reading, that Palestinian fighters are breaking into Israel through the fence. I hear that hundreds of people, as I said, have been taken to hospital in Israel. There's an awful lot going on, but I suspect that there's an awful lot of misreporting or double reporting or triple reporting of the same events. And it will take several hours, I think, before we have a clearer picture of what exactly is happening. But if this event is on the scale that people are saying, then I would say that, this is again my guess, that in the Pentagon, in Congress, there will be further demands that support for Ukraine must now be scaled down in order to provide greater support for Israel. Conflict in Ukraine has drained American arsenals. The United States has even withdrawn shells, 155 millimeter shells, from American stockpiles in Israel to send to Ukraine. There will be more demands, more calls for that kind of thing to stop, and people in Congress, especially on the Republican side, but perhaps even some Democrats, will say that enough is enough. The United States has global responsibilities, including to long-standing allies like Israel. It cannot go on supporting Ukraine, sustaining the war effort there in Ukraine indefinitely to the extent that it has been doing. Now, that is all I'm going to say about this event. I am sure that we will be covering it in detail on the Duran over the next couple of days. As I said, I think it is important to let events take their course, to get a better sense of what exactly is happening, because, as I said, I'm not entirely trusting some of these early reports. We shall see, and then we will take a step back and we will consider and we will try to analyse this event on the Duran as objectively as we can. So, having said all of these things, and without in any way discounting the importance and perhaps even the momentous importance of the events that are taking place in the Middle East and in Israel and the Palestinian territories in particular, let me now turn again to that perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm going to say straight away that I'm getting an increasing sense that we are now indeed moving towards the end of the affair, that the Western powers are becoming increasingly exhausted by this conflict, that the doubts are now spreading, and we've now had an article by no less a person than David Ignatius, who many people, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, say is the unofficial voice of the CIA. Anyway, we've had a long article about the mood in Ukraine from no less a person than David Ignatius in the Washington Post. And it came out the day before yesterday, and it says, a hard choice lies ahead in Ukraine, but only Ukrainians can make it. And he says that he's just been to Ukraine, but he's found the mood in Ukraine very different and far more somber than it has been over the course of previous visits. He says the war in Ukraine is at once heartbreaking and uplifting. I can't see myself what is remotely uplifting about it, but anyway, that is what David Ignatius claims that he finds. I'm not going to argue with that. He says people can't disguise their fatigue or sorrow. The conflict is bleeding the country out. Ukrainians I spoke with during a 4-day visit know they can't keep fighting forever, seeking what might be an unachievable victory. But they won't stop either. And then you have heartbreaking comments, like ones from somebody called Maria Mezentseva, who is a member of the Ukrainian parliament, from Kharkiv, by the way. She says, if you stop, nothing makes sense. We attended so many funerals in the last 18 months. At everyone, I say with tears in my eyes, I will not stop until we reach our goal of expelling Russians from all occupied territories. So you see, again, the trap that Ukraine has found itself in, one which is very, very typical, a tragic trap, but a very typical one in many wars, that the sacrifice up to this point has been so great that giving up, surrendering, seeking a compromise, negotiating a peace that might have been possible through negotiations in the past, but achieving that peace now, for many, many Ukrainians, will seem like a massive betrayal. And then we have comments from Pavlo Klimkin, a former, and by the way, profoundly incompetent foreign minister. He says we have to be honest, people are tired. Last year it was confidence, maybe overconfidence. Now people feel it's a classic attrition war. Nearly every family has someone killed. I would not try to sell the people an option that falls short of victory because it's personal. So these people the people who've experienced all of these sacrifices, they are left in the position where they might be asked, told at some point that those sacrifices are in vain. And what we're seeing from Ukrainian politicians, and both Mezhentseva and Klimkin are, of course, politicians, supporters of the Maidan movement, is that they're afraid that if they turn back and face these people that they've spoken to in this way and admit to them that all those sacrifices were in vain, then, of course, their own position will be in jeopardy, and the whole situation that Ukraine is in, that the Maidan movement faces, will become critical. Now, of course, that is not what David Ignatius says. It is my interpretation of these words, but let me say again, that is something that has happened in previous conflicts. Any discussion of these events which ignores what has happened in previous conflicts perhaps fails to see that. And then Ignatius admits Ukrainians are now willing to talk more openly about ways to end the war than during my visits last year. And he says that at a dinner with a group of parliamentarians at a restaurant on the Dnieper River, that's in Kiev, there is a noisy debate about the best strategy for saving the country. And he then talks about Oleksiy Goncharenko, who is an MP from Odessa, and he says he's an opposition MP, and he presses members of President Zelensky's party. He says, I'm very concerned. Why? Take a look at the front. It doesn't change. For a year, it doesn't change, but it was paid for by a huge amount of lives. Ukraine can't fight as long as it takes. That will be a catastrophe. And apparently Goncharenko says that Ukraine should seek security guarantees and give up the idea of expelling Russia from the territories it occupies. And then Mezhentseva responds that we don't have a choice. They want to raise us. That's, of course, a Maidan view. And Khomenko, another pro-government MP, says the military way of defending our country is the only way possible. We can't give up on Crimea. But Yushchenko responds, we all want everything, but this is the real world, and we must make decisions from real options. We don't have unlimited time, and we don't have unlimited people. And, of course, that is not a view that the present Ukrainian government can accept. As I said, Mezhentseva essentially gives it away. How can she face the people she has called on to make all those sacrifices, given if the only result is a defeat, or at least a compromise, which Ukraine could have had before all those sacrifices took place, and which will call those sacrifices into question. And then we have admissions for people like Colonel Gennady Govalenko. We depend 100% on the United States. And he wonders, apparently, he leaves open the question of what happens in Ukraine if the United States withdraws its support. And then, of course, Ignatius himself makes a number of observations. The best practice strategy is surely to stay the course, especially when people begin to despair. And well, I don't understand that sentence. And if Ukraine has the will to continue and the United States and its partners remain firm in their commitment and of support, then as long as it takes is the right course. This is Ignatius's words. But then he goes on to say, but if Ukraine seriously questions whether it can survive a fight that might take many years, then it needs to think about a way to freeze this conflict on its own terms, with a security guarantee from the United States as part of the deal. And he finishes by saying that Larisa Bilozir, a member of parliament from eastern Ukraine, says we are in grief. She has just returned from her district where 304 people have died in the war, and a visit coincided with the funerals of 2 young men. So, essentially, here we have Ignatius himself. He's talking about the collapse of morale in Ukraine, because that's what it amounts to, of a political leadership, President Zelensky, his regime, if I can use that expression, all digging in, terrified of admitting to their own people that all their sacrifices were in vain. Ignatius doesn't mention that, but also unquestionably terrified of the hard men on Ukraine's far right and of people within the Ukrainian deep state, people like Kirill Budanov, the intelligence chief, terrified of what they might do, unable therefore to negotiate, still talking about endless war, though they can't provide a realistic plan for victory, and at the same time, despite the fact that they acknowledge that without the support of the West, without the support of the United States, the whole struggle anyway is hopeless, and they're starting to have fears, increasing fears, that support in the United States and in the West is starting to waver. And it is not just in the United States. We now go to an article in Politico, which has the rather gloomy title, Shambles in Granada, mega gathering of European leaders ends with a whimper. 49 leaders, 700 journalists, dozens of bilateral meetings, and no decisions. And in fact, we see them all together. They're all in Granada. You see pictures of them in the Alhambra Palace, left over from the time of the Muslim presence in Spain, one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. They're all there. They're all meeting with each other. They're all discussing various things. But they came up with nothing. And the article from Politico admits this. Much talk about support for Ukraine, but nothing of substance, no actual aid package was agreed because of the opposition, of course, from increasing numbers of countries. I discussed yesterday how there are disputes now amongst European leaders. The relationship between Macron, the President of France, and Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, is becoming apparently so toxic that there's attempts to try and bring these two together in order to sort this all out. There is a furious row now between Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel over the issue of Ukraine's accession. There is another article in Politico which says that backlash grows against Ukraine's accession. There's more and more opposition, including from countries like Poland, it turns out, not to mention Hungary and Slovakia, against any idea of ramming through Ukraine's accession into the EU quickly. So support for Ukraine is stuck. And there was Zelensky in the middle of this meeting. Many people have pointed out, Simplicus the Thinker has pointed out on his latest Citra, that he looked absolutely exhausted and demoralized and shattered as he found himself in this meeting. All kinds of words of support, but nothing practically provided to him. Nothing that he can take back with him to Kiev, which will change the situation in the conflict, the direction of travel in this war. One meeting, by the way, which President Zelensky did have, there's even a photo of it, is with another person, another leader from the former Soviet Union, from another republic of the former Soviet Union, and that was Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan of Armenia. And of course, he came to Granada expecting that there would be a meeting there, that President Aliyev of Azerbaijan and President Erdogan of Turkey would also come, and there would be negotiations brokered by the European Union moving forward towards this peace treaty that he expects, and which, of course, the European Union and the United States are keen to have, because from their point of view, they need a peace treaty, they need a resolution, a full, final, complete, cast-iron resolution of the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which only partly relates to Nagorno-Karabakh, in order that they can press forward with their grand plan of eventually including Armenia into the Euro-Atlantic system. However, neither Aliyev nor Erdogan turned up. And I go back to that Politico article. Hope among attendees in taking steps to resolve the humanitarian crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh were dashed when both Azerbaijan's Ilham Aliyev and Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan decided to skip the gathering. Leaders hoped to host the first meeting between Aliyev and Pashinyan since Azerbaijan launched a lightning offensive in Nagorno-Karabakh, triggering an exodus of 100,000 refugees. Azerbaijan accused France of bias in negotiations and ultimately agreed to talk, but only under the auspices of the EU in Brussels, according to Aliyev's presidential aide Hikmet Hajiev on social media. In my opinion, the only mediator that the Azerbaijanians will probably want to work with is Russia. And why should they agree to a peace treaty with Armenia anyway? What is the incentive for Azerbaijan now to agree such a treaty? They're not going to see their position, their relationship with the European Union seriously questioned. They're too important as an oil provider. They're too strategically positioned in the Caucasus for the Americans and the Europeans to turn on them. They've got what they wanted in Nagorno-Karabakh without making any kind of concessions at all. And from their perspective, there's going to be a peace treaty with Armenia. Well, it'll have to be on their terms, and they probably sense that they're more likely to broker that through the Russians. And besides, why would they want to see that rival and adversary, Armenia, in the EU and in NATO, if that is the ultimate destination point. So they might just as well stay away. And that, of course, is what they have done. Of course, they won't slam the door on negotiations entirely. No one ever does that. If they're wise and they're involved in a conflict, the Russians are careful not to do it over the conflict in Ukraine. But they will string the Armenians, the Americans, and the Europeans along, and they will gradually increase their pressure on Azerbaijan. They have Turkey's support, on Armenia, sorry. They have Turkey's support in doing it, and gradually, step by step, bit by bit, they will get more of what they want. Without a solid alliance between Armenia and Russia, the only country in the Southern Caucasus that is able to intervene in Armenia's on Armenia's side, there is no real pressure on the Azerbaijanians to agree to anything. And there's also an admission from Politico that attempts to diffuse tensions between Serbia and the authorities in Kosovo have not resulted in much, and Politico concludes the sense of fruitlessness of the informal summit culminated when the host country, Spain, cancelled a planned press conference at the last minute, the expected highlight of the summit for about 700 journalists. It was meant to include statements and formally mark the handing over of the stewardship of the European political community from Spain to the United Kingdom. And neither Scholz nor Sunak spoke to the media, and neither did Macron. He had nothing to say on his way into the meeting. And he did have a press conference, but again, he didn't say very much. And when asked about this is Macron, asked about the US holding up aid for Ukraine, the French president called billions of dollars in US support a wonderful compliment to the European Union's contribution, but cautioned it cannot replace our European mobilization. Of course, the reason there was no press conference is that had there been, it would have been very, very difficult to answer questions without exposing and perhaps even increasing further the rifts that exist within the entire Ukraine project, which, to be very clear, was, as always, the centerpiece of this entire discussion. So the Granada meeting, a flop, the situation in Congress becoming increasingly volatile. It seems there might be as many as 100 Republicans in the House, that's to say half the caucus there, who are now dead opposed to support continued funding for Ukraine. The administration can keep funding going, probably to some extent indefinitely, by finding bits of money here and there from various other programs. The European Union can do its bit, but without a formal authorization from Congress, it is going to be impossible to sustain aid to anything like the same level as in the past. So, Ukraine, demoralization increasing, the Europeans divided, the Americans arguing, Ukraine's allies becoming increasingly doubtful, and as I discussed yesterday in that program I did, the Ukrainian offensive itself now stuck. There was that long article in the London Times which admitted that there's been no real breakthrough in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector of the front lines, that Ukraine is continuing to suffer massive losses, no successful advances. The situation on the front lines remains critical. Ukraine is exhausting its forces in these continuing offensives. Going back to David Ignatius's article, we had that comment from Oleksiy Goncharenko, the opposition MP. I'm very concerned. Take a look at the front. It doesn't change. For a year, it doesn't change. But it was paid for by a huge amount of lives. Ukraine can't fight as long as it takes. That will be a catastrophe. And in the meantime, as we've now seen from the Russians, they watch and they wait and they build up their forces steadily and even more. We get more reports now about hundreds of thousands of more troops being assembled, going through their training. More reports all the time of more equipment reaching the Russian forces. There's a report yesterday in CBS, by the way, which I don't take vastly seriously. I don't consider it terribly reliable. It was based on a report from our old friend, the unnamed administration source, that North Korea has now started to supply artillery shells to Russia. Well, who knows? But anyway, the fact is, the Russians, their military industries are now operating at an ever higher tempo. More tanks, more shells, more ammunition is being produced. More troops are being trained and gradually assembled. Symblikis the thinker, his latest Sirtrep, has a interesting timeline for what he thinks is going to happen. He doesn't think that there will be any big Russian offensive this winter. He thinks that the Russians are most likely to go on training their forces and building them up over the course of the winter. They have 420,000 more troops, or expect to have 420,000 more troops by year end. Perhaps recruitment will continue beyond that in the first months of 2024. There might be as many as 1 million men being gathered and concentrated by the spring. Increasingly, these troops are receiving their training. As I said, those who were trained at the start of the year, who joined up at the start of this year, will now have either completed or be close to completing their training by now. And every day we hear more reports of more tanks and more machines. And of course, defense spending in Russia, as Putin, by the way, has confirmed, will be increased by 70% next year. The Russians are increasing the scale of their arms production even further next year. And all of that points to a continued build-up. And Symblikis the thinker thinks that the most likely course of events is that rather than launch a big arrow ground offensive this winter, the Russians will continue attrition if the Ukrainians are reckless and unwise enough to try and continue their offensive through the autumn and winter. That will actually work to the Russians' advantage. It will enable the attrition, the weakening of Ukraine's forces, of its military, to continue. And in the meantime, and at the same time, the Russians are likely at some point to launch a massive missile and bomb offensive against Ukraine's remaining infrastructure, its energy system, and there's now an accumulation of reports, including in The Economist, that the Ukrainian energy system has not been properly repaired following the bomb offensive of last year. My guess, by the way, as to that, is that all the hopes were staked on the Ukraine's summer counteroffensive. There were wide expectations that there would be some kind of big breakthrough over the course of the summer. And when that didn't happen, the Ukrainians hadn't really planned for that, and nor had the West, so that the energy system remains in bad shape and in a fragile condition, and very much more vulnerable to a Russian missile offensive than it was last year. And it's important to say that the Russians are in a much better position anyway, and in addition, to launch that offensive. Missile production, by all accounts, has increased, perhaps by multiples, and of course drones, Geranium-2 drones, and who knows, perhaps other types of drones. They are available to the Russians in massively greater quantities than was the case last year. And moreover, these drones and these missiles are becoming more sophisticated. They're able to maneuver more effectively. Some of them are able to apparently do circuits and change directions in order to confuse and spoof the Ukrainian defenders. And there are more types of missiles. There are reports that the Russians have developed a cruise missile with a range of 6,500 kilometers, much longer range than the cruise missiles the Russians have been operating against Ukraine up to this point. And it seems that this particular cruise missile is also more maneuverable. The fact that it can operate over these enormous distances means that it can loiter, it can move around, it can change course in all kinds of unexpected ways, putting the Ukrainians in a position where it'll become more and more difficult for their air defense system to counter this much bigger drone offensive and missile offensive that the Russians might be in the process of launching. And of course, Ukraine's air defense system is much weaker than it was at this time last year. Most of the S-300s have apparently now been used up. The numbers that are left are apparently older versions, some of them not in particularly good states of repair. There are Western supplied systems. We've been hearing less about the Patriots recently. There's suggestions that the numbers of Patriot missiles have dwindled, and then the United States is unwilling or perhaps unable to replace them, certainly not one for one. There's more supplies of Iris-T missiles and NASAMS missiles and Hawk missiles, but this is an odd patchwork of different types of missiles. They are not the same integrated kind of system that Ukraine started with last year, with an integrated air defense system based on Soviet-era missiles and radars and control facilities. That doesn't exist to the same extent anymore as it did last year. So the Ukrainian air defense system is in much more ragged shape. And going back to that article in the London Times, Ukraine anyway has a very difficult choice, because with the Russian Air Force becoming increasingly active on the front lines, that article in the London Times had a Ukrainian soldier saying that on the single town of Orekhov, on the Zaporozhye battlefronts, the Russians drop between 25 and 30 bombs a day on Orekhov, precision-guided bombs. Might be an exaggeration, But that's what he said. And he also says that the town is now essentially destroyed. It looks increasingly like Bakhmut. Anyway, with reports that the Russian Air Force is now constantly operating, hammering away at Ukrainian defenses, or Ukrainian troops on the front lines, what do the Ukrainians do? Do they forward deploy their surface-to-air missile systems? And Maxim Tucker, the London Times journalist, spoke of his astonishment to find an entire S-300 battery deployed out in the open in broad daylight, just 9 miles from the combat line, desperately vulnerable to Russian artillery and drone strikes with these deadly Lancet and enhanced Lancet kamikaze drones. So do the Ukrainians try to protect their troops with whatever dwindling air defense assets they have, or do they withdraw their air defense assets to try to protect what's left of their energy system and the key positions in their cities, leaving the troops on the front line exposed to even more relentless hammering by the Russian Air Force? So, Simplicius the thinker thinks we will have that kind of Russian offensive. It'll be similar to the one that took place last year over the course of the winter. It will be much more relentlessly pursued than was the case last year. I always remember that key article by John Helmer based on information provided, and this was an article that appeared in his blog site Dancing with Bears last year, that the purpose of that missile offensive, apart from depleting Ukraine's air defense system, which it did extremely effectively, but its purpose was also partly to identify weaknesses in Ukraine's energy system, so that when the moment came to strike it and to cause real damage to it, the Russians would know how to do it and to do it most effectively. So Simplicius the thinker thinks that we're going to have more of that happening, and that's going to be the main story over the course of the winter, but that it will be devastating and it will cause Ukraine enormous damage. And in the meantime, putting aside all of that, but staying for the moment with the issue of an air offensive, the Russians continue to launch precision-guided strikes almost every day. They've done it again last night, more missile strikes on Ukrainian ports, warehouses, ammunition depots, those kind of facilities, with missiles this time, but also, of course, and now always, every night with drones. There's talk that Russian uranium-2 production could reach 500 such drones a day, which is a staggering number and gives us some idea of what the Russians might be preparing. Might, for all I know, go even higher than that. But anyway, even as we talk about that kind of strategic offensive against the energy system, the kind of operational tactical offensive that the Russians are undertaking seems to be continuing. It started, by the way, in a big way, as I remember back in March, when the Russians started to strike Ukrainian ammunition and dumps and warehouses and logistical places ahead of Ukraine launching its offensive. And pretty deadly and effective they were, and depleting even faster Ukraine's already desperately short ammunition stocks. But of course, we've been hearing over the last few days that something new has also started to happen, which is that the Russians now seem to be much more successful in striking and destroying Ukrainian trains transporting men and equipment to the front lines, as is the case with the Russian military. Ukraine relies on its railway system to keep its front lines supplied and reinforced, and to deploy and redeploy its forces. And in the past, the Russians have had only limited success destroying Ukrainian trains, but it seems that over the last few weeks, their success in destroying trains has increased significantly, and that, of course, as things continue and develop, is going to have an effect on Ukraine's ability to move its forces around the battlefields and to reinforce and to keep supplied its forces in forward positions. So we could start to see more of that happening. And lastly, the Russians are now operating a psychological war campaign against the Ukrainians. About 6 weeks ago, they started a radio station, apparently it's called Volga, which gives Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefronts information about where they can, the best route that they can take in order to desert the Ukrainian army and to surrender to the Russians, to defect, in effect. Now, the Russians are claiming that more than 10,000 Ukrainians have listened and acted upon these broadcasts and have indeed handed themselves over to the Russians in that way. This is, of course, all part of a propaganda war, and I'm going to take any information of that kind with an immense dose of skepticism. I don't know that this is true, and there is no external corroboration for it. But given what even people like David Ignatius are saying about the growing demoralization in Ukraine, and that's ultimately what his article is talking about, it would not surprise me. We saw, going back to that London Times article, that even a Ukrainian officer of the 47th Mechanized Brigade told the British journalist Maxim Tucker that what he wanted to do was to go home. He is sick of the war. He wants to see an end. He wants to go home. Too many of his friends have died. He himself feels that he's in deep S. You can add the word. Anyway, he has had enough. He wants to go home. So it's not implausible that more and more Ukrainian soldiers are indeed handing themselves in to the Russians, that the process of desertion is indeed growing. And in fact, yesterday, there were pretty reliable reports from the front lines that somewhere on the battlefronts, an entire Ukrainian unit basically surrendered to the Russians without a fight, giving up its positions and letting themselves go into captivity. I'm not quite sure how many men were involved, perhaps a platoon, perhaps less, but anyway, it was not a huge number. We're not talking about a battalion or a brigade or anything of that nature. But anyway, apparently, increasingly, we are seeing surrenders of that kind. So, quite plausibly, people like Simplicius the Thinker, and by the way, Brian Beletic, are absolutely right. maybe it is indeed the case that the Russians, seeing the way that things are going, seeing the way that Ukraine is being ground down, it's being ground into dust, seeing also how the Russian casualty rates are falling and how Russia itself continues to grow stronger, seeing also the increasing dissension and confusion in the West about what to do, that the Russians see no reason to start a big offensive now, that they're willing to let this thing play along because they know that when the big blow comes, when all their soldiers are properly trained and when all their soldiers are properly equipped and when they have, by some calculations, 1 million men ready to take the battle to the Ukrainians sometime maybe in the late spring or early summer of 2024. Well, at that point, they can be confident that the resistance that they will encounter, though no doubt intense in some places, will be unsustainable and that they can win the war with minimal losses to themselves. I think this is an entirely plausible view, and it would be consistent with what Shoigu is alleged to have said to the Defense Ministry's board about a couple of days ago, which some people say that it referenced a plan to end the war by 2025. As I said, my own understanding from reading the English translation provided by the Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, is that Action Plan 2025 was intended to reference some kind of larger procurement plan, which is only partly related to the war itself, but perhaps that was the Russian Defense Ministry toning down the translation in order to try and take us away from the focus of what Shoigu actually meant. I'm not sure. I will add one personal view. I think that there is likely to be some kind of a Russian offensive over the course of this winter. People always say that there was no Russian offensive last winter, but as I've already pointed out, there actually was, and it was a devastating one. It was the Russian offensive that culminated eventually in the fall of Bakhmut. It caused massive attrition to the Ukrainian military, and it severely weakened the Ukrainian army. It alarmed the United States. It didn't perhaps capture much territory, but as so many people, Brian Beletic, others have been saying for so long now, the Russians have not been fighting the war in order to gain territory fast. They have been fighting the war in order to cause the maximum degree of attrition to Ukraine. And it does seem to me that the Russians might do the same thing again this winter. And the obvious place they would do it would be in the north, on the northern parts of the front line. And there is an increasing accumulation of reports that the Russians have lured Ukrainian reinforcements to take positions east of the Oskol River line. Oskol River. Ukrainians were alarmed by the prospect of the loss of Kupiansk, and so they moved their rushed reinforcements from their reserves to try to stem the Russian advance around Kupiansk and further south, close to the Oskol River, that they moved large forces to defensive positions around here, And in doing so, they placed these reinforcements in an extremely precarious position, with the bridges over the Oskol River now destroyed by the Russian Air Force, and with the Russians therefore in a good position to carry out some kind of envelopment and to destroy these forces east of the Oskol River. And it could be that we could be seeing in the next few weeks a Russian offensive there. It's been suggested that too many Ukrainian troops now, too many Ukrainian units are concentrated in a small bridgehead east of the Oskol River. This puts them in a position of great vulnerability, with the Russian artillery and Russian Air Force now increasingly active in this area, and it also puts them in a position where they could find themselves enveloped either in a cauldron or in a semi-cauldron. And another place where something similar might be tried further south is in this chunk of low-lying territory that the Ukrainians have carved out for themselves between Rabotino and Verbovoye. Their attempts to broaden this area by advancing west of Rabotino towards Kupani for the moment seem to be unsuccessful, and it could be that the Russians will act to try to turn this salient that the Ukrainians have created into a cauldron, trapping the Ukrainian troops, those Ukrainian troops who find themselves inside it. Well, these are just guesses on my part. Now, I haven't discussed in this program what the Ukrainians might do. There remains that tantalizing possibility of a Ukrainian strike across the Dnieper River. I think weather conditions are making that increasingly unlikely. The weather continues to deteriorate. But given how desperate the situation is becoming, given the kind of despairing comments you see from people within Zelensky's party, reported by David Ignatius, it's not impossible that the Ukrainians will try and go for broke, try to achieve some kind of quick victory to turn the situation round. And anyway, we'll just have to wait and see. As I said, in terms of what else has been happening on the front lines over the last 24 hours, I'll repeat again what I've been saying many times. A lot of fighting, a lot of soldiers killed, mostly, from what I can judge now, Ukrainians. Ukraine, however, failing to make headway in any place. In fact, there are some reports that to the extent that either side, any side, is making any headway at all, it is increasingly Russia, with counter-attacks in the Vremivka salient, and perhaps with further advances towards Kupiansk and on the Oskol River. So that's the overall situation. Now, I'm going to just add one very last observation, and it's a historically formed one. There's been many people who are making comparisons with various wars that have taken place in the past, but I have to say that some of the rhetoric that's now coming out of Kiev does remind me increasingly of things that I have read about what people were saying in the German political and military leadership towards the end of the Second World War. Now, this is not here making any kind of ideological comparisons, but it became increasingly clear to the Germans, to the German leadership, after 1943, that the odds were turning heavily against them, and they continued to turn further against them as the war continued. But Germany, like Ukraine, despite all of that, despite the fact that the writing was ever more clearly on the wall, continued fighting. And there's been lots of discussion and lots of assumptions and beliefs about why they did that. The power of the German leader and his ability to instill confidence in his soldiers, and delusional expectations of what wonder weapons might do and things of that kind. And there was indeed some of that, in fact quite a lot of that. But it's important to say that the Germans, the top German leaders amongst each other, actually did have a more realistic understanding of what the situation was, and did talk to each other about ways to try to get out of this trap that Germany had been led into. And one of the reasons why they continued the war was because the top German leadership understood that if the war ended with Germany capitulating, they would lose power, and quite plausibly, and in the end, as it turned out, correctly, that they themselves would lose their lives. So for that reason, they were determined to hold on to power, and that meant keeping the war going. Now, I'm not saying that the political leadership in Kiev risks its life to the same degree as the German leadership did, but I've already said that you see from David Ignatius's article that they are doubtful, that you can sense behind the brave words, behind the defiance, an understanding that after so many sacrifices, if they were to turn round and tell their people that it had been all for nothing, then their own political position would be in severe jeopardy, and they might face the anger of their people. So there was some of that. But there was also, in Germany, a belief that, yes, some kind of negotiation did need to happen, but that Germany could not negotiate from a position of defeat or apparent defeat, that the Germans needed some big victory somewhere in order to persuade the Allies that the war was going to be prolonged and that it was going to go on forever, and that the Allies therefore had no rational choice but to negotiate an end to the war with the Germans. And in fact, you see various attempts by the Germans, by the German leadership, towards the end of the war to achieve some victory in some place that would put them in that position of advantage. The famous Ardennes offensive of December 1944 being one such example. Well, I sometimes wonder whether something of the same calculus isn't now working in Ukraine, whether Ukrainian leaders aren't perhaps telling themselves the same thing, that for the sake of their own survival and perhaps the survival of their own country. And by the way, German leaders were also telling their people in the run-up to the end of the war that Germany's existence was at stake, just as the Ukrainian leaders are telling their people that Ukraine's existence is at stake, and that's why the war must go on. Anyway, it could be, it's entirely plausible, it seems to me, that the Ukrainians are now desperately looking for a victory. Not to keep the war going indefinitely, but to try to put themselves in that position of being in a stronger position to negotiate from. And that's why we've seen these desperate attempts to try to break through to Klashevka, to capture Kopani, or the talk about reaching Tokmak, perhaps this strike across the Dnieper. Well, if that is the Ukrainian thinking, just as was the case with the Germans, it is a mirage. There's no reason to think that even if Ukraine is able to pluck such a tactical victory out of the hat, it is going to change anything in the end about the direction of the war. There is about this affair now a sense of gravity. The gravity that is pulling Ukraine down. And I can't see what can happen that can ultimately reverse this course. The effort to try to pull back from this, all it's going to do is increase losses and, of course, accelerate the moment of what is now perhaps becoming an inevitable collapse. If Ukraine wants to survive, if it really wants to continue to exist as an independent state, it needs to listen to the advice of that MP from Odessa. And the war is unsustainable. It must begin negotiations now. And interestingly enough, there is perhaps one glimmer of an opening still available to Ukraine. Sometime over the next couple of days or weeks, Vladimir Putin is flying to Beijing. The Chinese have, in the past, offered themselves as potential negotiators. So, why not call Xi Jinping? Unlike Putin, he's probably prepared to take Zelensky's calls. Why not call Xi Jinping and tell him that Ukraine is prepared to negotiate, and is prepared to negotiate this time seriously, with an understanding that the terms will be harsher, much harsher than those that were available last year, and will be such as will be determined by the Russians. Well, I don't expect the Ukrainians to do that. But anyway, as I've said many times, let it never be said that that option doesn't exist. It clearly does. It is there for the taking. Anyway, this is where I end this video. I have been able to do a complete video, as you can see today, and more from me soon. To remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals on Rumble, and also X. And please remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Supply Star, Patreon and Supply Star, and of course remember to go to our shop, where we're now having, by the way, a sale. You can get things at a 20% discount. So this is an opportunity you can't, of course, turn your back on. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. I'm sorry if this has been a somewhat, as I said, pressured video, perhaps less structured than some of my other ones. But anyway, I hope nonetheless that you found it interesting. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.